Imagine moving into your dream home in a quiet Colorado neighborhood, expecting peace, privacy, and control over your own property. But within months, the HOA comes knocking, angry about a short-term rental in the community. And suddenly, your life as a homeowner is upended. Letters arrive in the mailbox, notices pop up in your inbox, meetings are called, and now, the HOA is talking about changing the bylaws. Yes, the very rules that govern the HOA itself, just to ban STRs. Reddit user TrulyBobBarker captured the panic perfectly. I am not sure if limiting STRs would be a bylaw or a CC&R change. Confusion, frustration, fear, they're all bubbling up in this community. And if you're thinking, why can't the board just decide? Hold that thought. This story exposes exactly how much power HOAs have, and more importantly, how much power homeowners actually hold. The HOA argued their bylaws supersede the town code, which technically allows STRs. But the homeowners discovered a twist. Bylaws govern the board, not property owners, and material changes affecting property use, like banning STRs, require a supermajority vote of the homeowners. Imagine sitting in your kitchen, reading the legalese, trying to figure out if 25% of the board is enough to pass a rule, or if 67% of homeowners must approve. The lines blur, the rules are complex, and the stakes are real. Some neighbors are ready to fight, while others fear the board's power. Reddit commenters weighed in with warnings. It's a material change, so 67%, wrote one. Another explained, bylaws bind the HOA board, CC&Rs bind homeowners. It's much harder to change CC&Rs. Already, the community is split. Tempers flare. Conversations turn into arguments. And at the heart of it, a fundamental question emerges. Should an HOA board be able to restrict property use on its own? Or does the homeowner vote decide the outcome? Viewers, this is more than a legal debate. It's a real-life drama, a battle of power versus rights. And it's happening right now in Colorado, in a community that thought it was peaceful and predictable. In the next segment, we'll dive deep into how TrulyBobBarker discovered the rules buried in the bylaws and CC&Rs, why the board thought they could act unilaterally, and the shocking legal details that homeowners need to know before their freedoms are quietly erased. When TrulyBobBarker moved into their Colorado single-family home, the neighborhood seemed perfect. Quiet streets, manicured lawns, and a community with what looked like reasonable rules. Life felt secure, predictable, normal. But that calm was about to shatter. The HOA, typically just a background entity enforcing landscaping and parking rules, suddenly focused all their energy on short-term rentals, STRs. A neighbor was renting their home for Airbnb-style stays, and the board was furious. They believed STRs would disrupt community standards and could potentially lower property values. Their solution? Change the bylaws to ban STRs entirely. The first red flag for TrulyBobBarker came when the HOA management company issued a notice about the proposed changes. The board claimed, "Our bylaws supersede town code. We can regulate STRs as we see fit." But here's the twist. The town itself did not prohibit short-term rentals. Legally, homeowners had the right to rent their property on a short-term basis. So, the HOA's move wasn't just aggressive, it was confrontational, potentially overstepping their authority. Confused, TrulyBobBarker did what many homeowners in their shoes do, turn to Reddit for guidance. They posted, "I am not sure if limiting STRs would be a bylaw or a CC&R change." Within hours, the thread exploded. Responses ranged from practical advice to sharp warnings. Rasky Bukowski wrote, 67% and a time frame with notice. Likely a lawyer unless someone knows how to file it. Killer Code Monkey clarified, bylaws bind the board, CC&Rs bind homeowners. The board can amend bylaws, but anything affecting property rights is much harder to change. The reality was sinking in. The HOA board could push proposals, but the homeowners ultimately held the power over material changes affecting property use. The distinction between bylaws and CC&Rs, obscure and easily misunderstood, was suddenly life-changing. The documents themselves were dense, full of legalese that could confuse even experienced readers. TrulyBobBarker highlighted Article 12, Amendments. These bylaws may be amended by a vote of a majority of a quorum of the board, or at any annual meeting, by the affirmative vote of members holding at least 67%, 67% of members present at the meeting in person, or represented by proxy. At first glance, it seemed the board could act alone if a quorum was present. But the Reddit community quickly pointed out the nuance. This only applied to internal governance of the HOA, not to property rights like STR usage. That required a supermajority of homeowners, 67%, to amend the declaration or CC&Rs. Even more confusion arose around quorum. Truly, Bob Barker noted, there is a clause earlier that says the minimum quorum is 25% unless it specifically says otherwise. Homeowners now realize that while a small portion of the community could technically vote on some internal matters, major decisions affecting property rights would need overwhelming homeowner participation. Tensions escalated further as the community debated internally. Some residents were fully against STRs, citing noise, security, and parking issues. Others were frustrated, defending the right to rent their homes freely. Reddit commenters warned, "It's not going to be easy. Whoever has tenants or may want them in the future will likely fight it," wrote Rasky Bukowski. "The declaration should be harder to amend. We require a supermajority of owners," noted Own Grapefruit 8839, a board member in another HOA. Truly, Bob Barker now understood the stakes. This wasn't just a policy change. It was a clash of power between a small board and the homeowners' rights. Any attempt to bypass proper procedures could spark legal battles, community resentment, and even permanent division. And yet, the HOA was pushing forward. Meetings were scheduled, notices circulated. Homeowners started reviewing documents, consulting lawyers, and forming alliances. Reddit became a hub of real-time strategy and advice. Father of Greyhounds reminded everyone, the existing STR would be grandfathered in. Even if they pass a rule, it doesn't apply retroactively. Any size suckling pigs clarified. Any rule that restricts how property is used, such as prohibiting or limiting STRs, is supposed to be in the declaration, requiring at least 67% owner approval. The situation illustrated a critical lesson for any homeowner. HOA boards may have authority over day-to-day operations, but they cannot trample property rights without homeowner consent. That distinction would determine the outcome of this battle. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the community was on edge. Homeowners were armed with knowledge, alliances, and legal guidance. The board, meanwhile, remained convinced that swift action was necessary. The stage was set for a confrontation that could redefine the rules of the neighborhood forever. Truly, Bob Barker later reflected on the chaos. "I am glad the board can just change the rules without our input. That's a huge relief." But the tension, uncertainty, and looming vote made it clear. In HOAs, understanding your governing documents is more than just reading legal papers. It's about protecting your life, your home, and your rights. The HOA meeting that followed felt less like a neighborhood gathering and more like the opening round of a courtroom battle. Homeowners filed into the clubhouse, clutching copies of bylaws, CC&Rs, and printouts from Reddit threads. The board members sat at the front, calm, confident, and clearly convinced they had the authority to ban short-term rentals with nothing more than a simple vote. The tension was so thick you could feel it. Every word, every gesture carried weight. This wasn't about lawns or parking tickets anymore. This was about who actually controlled the future of the community. The board opened by declaring, "We have the right to amend bylaws at any time, as long as a majority of the board is present. STRs are not in the best interest of our community, and we intend to ban them." At first, some homeowners nodded in agreement. The fear of strangers renting homes next door, potential noise, and parking issues made the board's reasoning sound appealing. But others, armed with knowledge from Truly Bob Barker's research and Reddit comments, weren't buying it. One homeowner stood up and said, "Excuse me, but the bylaws don't govern our property rights. They only govern the board. If you're talking about banning rentals, that's a CC&R issue, and it requires a supermajority of homeowners, not just a board vote." The room erupted in murmurs. The board tried to downplay the statement, insisting their interpretation was correct. But then, Truly Bob Barker produced the receipts, highlighted sections of Article 12, side-by-side comparisons of bylaws and CC&Rs, and quotes straight from the community's governing documents. On Reddit, commenters had prepared them for this very moment. One had written, "Any rule that restricts how property is used is supposed to be in the declaration. Declarations require 67% owner approval. Don't let them trick you into thinking a board vote is enough. That line became a rallying cry. Homeowners began demanding clarification. Is this a bylaw amendment or a CC&R amendment? Where's the legal notice of a special meeting? Have we consulted an attorney on this? The board pushed back. They cited the 25% quorum clause, claiming they only needed a fraction of homeowners to attend for the vote to be valid. But sharp-eyed residents reminded them that quorum only applied to meetings, not to amendments impacting property rights. One Redditor's words echoed in the homeowners' minds. Quorum means who can attend and vote. Supermajority means who must approve. Don't let them confuse the two. The board grew visibly frustrated. Their simple plan to outlaw STRs with minimal resistance had exploded into a technical, legal, and emotional showdown. Then came the bombshell. One of the homeowners revealed they had already spoken with a real estate attorney. According to the attorney, if the HOA attempted to pass this as a bylaw change without the required supermajority homeowner vote, the amendment would be invalid and unenforceable, and the HOA could be sued for overreach. The board's faces tightened. The power dynamic had shifted. Suddenly, the authority they had projected seemed fragile. The community was no longer passive. They were informed, emboldened, and ready to challenge. But that didn't stop the drama. A heated debate broke out between neighbors themselves. One woman shouted, "I don't want strangers renting houses next to me. I bought here for stability, not for a revolving door of Airbnb guests." Another homeowner fired back, "It's my property, my mortgage, my decision. If I want to rent it for a week at a time, that's my right. You don't get to take that away because you're uncomfortable." Voices rose. People interrupted. The board struggled to regain order. The HOA meeting had devolved into a shouting match, exposing just how divided the community had become. In the middle of the chaos, Truly Bob Barker stayed focused. They asked the key question that silenced the room. If this bylaw change passes without a homeowner vote, are you prepared for a lawsuit? Dead silence. The board members exchanged glances. They hadn't expected this much pushback. They certainly hadn't expected homeowners to organize, research, and confront them so directly. But rather than backing down, the board doubled down. They announced they would proceed with a draft of the amendment and circulate it for review. This wasn't over. It was only beginning. The conflict spilled beyond the meeting. Neighbors who had once waved politely across lawns were now exchanging cold stares. Some whispered about forming alliances to block the amendment. Others quietly hoped the board would succeed, afraid that STRs could ruin the neighborhood's peace. On Reddit, the thread continued to explode with advice. One commenter warned, "If they try to slide this in as a bylaw amendment, call for a vote of no confidence in the board, remove them before they cost you in court." Another pointed out the irony. They're fighting STRs because of property values, but nothing tanks a community faster than legal battles and infighting. Truly Bob Barker began documenting everything: meeting notes, email exchanges, notices from the management company. They knew this wasn't just about STRs anymore. This was about accountability, transparency, and the limits of HOA power. And here's the kicker. Even if the HOA managed to pass the amendment correctly, with a full homeowner vote, any existing STRs would still be grandfathered in. They couldn't retroactively strip property rights from homeowners who were already operating rentals, which meant that the very issue sparking the conflict might not even be solved by the amendment. Imagine that. Months of fighting, countless hours of debate, legal consultations, and possible lawsuits, all for a rule that wouldn't even eliminate the current STRs. That realization left many homeowners shaking their heads. By the end of the week, the battle lines were drawn. The board believed they could force the change. The homeowners believed they held the power to stop it. And somewhere in the middle, the neighborhood's sense of community had been shattered. Truly Bob Barker summed it up best in their final Reddit update. "I'm glad the board can't just change the rules without our input. That's a huge relief. But this process has shown me just how far HOAs will go, and how much you need to understand your documents to protect yourself." And that's the heart of the conflict. When an HOA tries to overstep, the only thing standing between your rights and their control is knowledge, organization, and the courage to fight back. What happened in this Colorado neighborhood isn't some isolated drama. It's part of a much larger pattern, one that plays out in HOAs across the United States, from Florida to California, Texas to Nevada. And if you think your HOA can't pull stunts like this, think again. Across the country, boards have been caught bending, twisting, and outright ignoring the rules to push their agendas. Short-term rentals may be the battle here, but the war over HOA overreach is happening everywhere. Let's zoom out. The national crackdown on STR cities may have their own opinions on short-term rentals, but HOAs? They've become the frontline soldiers in this fight. In Arizona, an HOA tried to ban STRs by slipping language into its rules and regulations without ever touching the CC&Rs. Homeowners sued, and the court sided with them. The HOA didn't have the authority to restrict property rights without a proper amendment. The judge's ruling was crystal clear. Rules can't override governing documents. In Texas, one Redditor recounted how their HOA spent nearly 2 years trying to outlaw Airbnb homes. They hired a lawyer, drafted an amendment, and mailed it out. But when the homeowners saw they needed a supermajority, they revolted. It was dead before it started, the Redditor wrote. Nobody wanted to give the board that much control. And in Florida, ground zero for HOA controversies, several associations have quietly tried to ban STRs without proper votes. The strategy is the same. Push it through as a bylaw adjustment, hope nobody notices, and start sending fines. But the homeowners who fought back exposed the maneuver for what it was: an illegal power grab. The pattern of abuse isn't just about STRs. This issue taps into a much deeper trend: HOAs claiming powers they don't actually have. Think of it as mission creep. HOAs are supposed to maintain common areas, enforce existing restrictions, and preserve property values. But in practice, many overstep, trying to dictate everything from the color of your mailbox to whether you can park your own car in your own driveway. Take Georgia's Waldrop Place condominiums case. The HOA there literally shut off residents of water over unpaid fees, even though they had no legal authority to do so. The community was left scrambling, with residents calling plumbers, lawyers, and even the local news. Or California's Gina Kim case, where an HOA fined a woman $500 per day for installing a single interior door inside her own condo. The door wasn't visible from the outside. It didn't affect anyone. And yet, the HOA decided it violated architectural standards. Eventually, state law had to step in to cap fines. Then there's Texas again, where one HOA blocked home sales by refusing to provide lenders with necessary documents. One homeowner described it as financial hostage-taking. The board president held all the paperwork, and without it, buyers couldn't close. Families lost deals, sellers were trapped, and values plummeted. Why this keeps happening? The Colorado case makes it obvious. HOAs thrive on confusion. Governing documents are long, dense, and full of contradictions. Boards know most homeowners won't read them. And even if they do, the legal jargon is so confusing it's easy to misinterpret. That's why boards get away with saying things like, "We only need 25% quorum, so this vote is valid." This is a bylaw issue, not a CC&R amendment. The management company's lawyer confirmed this. But here's the truth. Quorum is not the same as approval. Bylaws do not override declarations. And an HOA's lawyer represents the HOA, not the homeowners. One Redditor broke it down perfectly. They weaponize the complexity. If you don't know your documents, you don't know your rights. The cost of fighting back. The tragedy is, even when homeowners are right, fighting back isn't easy. Lawsuits against HOAs are expensive, draining, and time-consuming. Boards know this. They rely on the fact that most homeowners won't have the money, time, or energy to wage a prolonged legal war. In one Florida community, homeowners had to crowdfund just to hire an attorney after the board tried to impose a rental ban. It took nearly a year in court, thousands in legal fees, and endless stress before the HOA finally backed down. And in Texas, the HOA that tried banning Airbnbs quietly shifted strategy. Instead of fighting homeowners directly, they updated their fining policy to target STR guests. Parking tickets, noise violations, trash penalties. The fines stacked so high that STR owners eventually gave up. They couldn't ban them outright, one resident explained, so they made it impossible to keep running them. The emotional toll. What gets lost in all this is the human cost. These aren't just legal battles. They're neighborhood wars, Friends become enemies. Neighbors stop waving. Entire communities fracture under the weight of HOA conflict. In the Colorado case, homeowners described giving each other the cold shoulder after the meeting. What used to be casual conversations about gardening or snow shoveling turned into whispered gossip about whose side people were on. One Redditor nailed it when they said, "Nothing destroys a community faster than an HOA fight." The board says it's about protecting property values, but the real damage comes from the division they create. The bigger picture. Why HOAs do this. So why does it keep happening? Because HOAs are structured to concentrate power in the hands of a few. A board of 5 people can control the fate of 200 homes. A management company's lawyer answers to the board, not the community. And the average homeowner doesn't realize their rights until it's too late. This is why STR bans, mailbox colors, and interior doors turn into full-scale wars. It's not really about the issue. It's about power, control, and who gets the final say. The Colorado case in context. The attempt to ban STRs in this small Colorado neighborhood isn't an isolated skirmish. It's one battle in a nationwide war between homeowners and HOAs. Across the U.S., the same themes repeat. Boards trying to expand their powers. Homeowners organizing to push back. Confusion over bylaws versus CC&Rs. Legal threats hanging over everything. It's a cycle of overreach, resistance, and fallout. And the question that lingers is this: how many homeowners know enough to fight back before it is too late? To fully understand this conflict, we need to step back from the personal drama and examine the framework that makes these situations possible. HOAs, or homeowners associations, are not informal neighborhood groups. They are quasi-governmental bodies, structured under nonprofit corporation statutes and empowered by legal contracts. Their authority rests on 2 pillars: the governing documents and state law. In Colorado, as in many other states, the primary governing documents are the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, the bylaws, and the articles of incorporation. Each has a different function. The CC&Rs bind the property itself. They regulate what owners can and cannot do with their homes. The bylaws, by contrast, regulate the HOA as an organization, outlining how meetings are conducted, how officers are elected, and how quorum is determined. And the articles establish the HOA's very existence as a corporate entity. When a conflict arises, the first legal principle is this: CC&Rs carry greater weight than bylaws. Courts consistently hold that the CC&Rs, being recorded with the county and tied to the property deed, cannot be casually altered. They require a supermajority of owners, commonly 67% or more, to approve any substantive amendment. Bylaws, on the other hand, can often be changed by a board vote or a lower threshold of members, since they do not directly restrict property rights. This distinction matters immensely in the Colorado case. The HOA board believed it could restrict short-term rentals through a bylaw change. But a bylaw restricting STRs directly affects how owners may use their property. That makes it a material change to the CC&Rs, not a procedural adjustment. And under Colorado law, material changes to property use require a supermajority vote of the entire ownership, not a simple board decision. Legally, if the board attempted to pass such a restriction unilaterally, it could be challenged in court. Homeowners would argue that the action was ultra vires, a Latin term meaning beyond the powers. Courts have repeatedly invalidated HOA rules that attempted to sidestep the amendment procedures set forth in the CC&Rs. Beyond the mechanics, there is a deeper legal question. Do HOAs have the right to limit otherwise lawful uses of property? Colorado municipalities, like many across the country, allow short-term rentals under certain conditions. If the city permits it, why should a private association override it? The answer lies in the contractual nature of HOAs. When a buyer purchases a property within an HOA, they enter into a binding contract to follow its rules. Courts generally enforce these rules as long as they are not arbitrary, capricious, or illegal. That brings us to the ethical dimension. At its core, this is not just a legal issue. It is a matter of property rights versus collective governance. On one side, individual owners argue, I paid for my home, I pay my taxes, I should decide how I use it. On the other, the HOA argues, we are a community, and individual choices affect collective quality of life. Noise, traffic, and safety are legitimate concerns. The ethics hinge on proportionality and fairness. Is it fair to ban all STRs because of potential problems, when responsible owners may comply with municipal regulations? Is it ethical for a board, often a handful of volunteers, to strip dozens or hundreds of owners of a property right without a democratic process? The answer, many ethicists argue, is no. When a rule has such sweeping consequences, the community itself must decide, not just its elected managers. Another ethical consideration is transparency. Homeowners often feel blindsided when boards propose sweeping changes with minimal notice. Proper governance requires open communication, clear agendas, and meaningful opportunities for homeowners to voice concerns. If a board pushes through a controversial change quietly, even if technically legal, it erodes trust and legitimacy. There is also the question of precedent. Once an HOA board succeeds in unilaterally restricting STRs, what comes next? Could they ban solar panels, limit the number of vehicles per household, or even dictate interior renovations under the guise of community harmony? Each overreach strengthens the board's hand and weakens the individual's autonomy. In Colorado, state law attempts to balance these tensions. The Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, CC&Rs, sets baseline requirements for HOAs, emphasizing owner participation and procedural safeguards. For example, Section 217 of the Act requires that any amendment to the CC&Rs receive the approval of a specified percentage of unit owners. Courts in Colorado have generally interpreted this strictly, requiring boards to adhere to the amendment process without shortcuts. Yet the law also recognizes the HOA's role in preserving property values and community standards. This dual recognition creates the tension we see in Truly Bob Barker's case. The HOA believes it is protecting the neighborhood from the disruptions of transient rentals. The homeowners, however, view it as a deprivation of their lawful rights. Both sides claim legitimacy, and the law provides tools for both, so long as the procedures are followed. Ethically, the golden rule should be consent and proportionality. Consent means that owners must have a meaningful voice in decisions that restrict their property rights. Proportionality means that rules should address genuine harms without imposing unnecessary burdens. A blanket ban on STRs, when municipal law already regulates them, arguably fails this test. For viewers, the lesson is clear. Never assume that your HOA board has unlimited authority. The documents matter. The law matters. And most importantly, your rights as a homeowner matter. If your board tries to impose sweeping restrictions, demand to see the legal basis. Demand transparency, and if necessary, demand a vote. Because in the end, an HOA's power is not absolute. It is contractual, conditional, and subject to both law and ethics.
To put this conflict in perspective, let's turn to the voices of authority, lawyers, HOA specialists, and community governance experts who deal with these issues every day. Their insight reveals not only what is legally required, but also how these conflicts tend to play out in practice. First, the legal lens. Real estate attorneys who specialize in common interest communities consistently point out one principle: the HOA board cannot exceed the powers granted in its governing documents. Attorney Mark Schechter of Denver explains it this way: if the CC&Rs say that property use restrictions must be approved by a supermajority, then that is the end of the matter. A bylaw amendment cannot take the place of a covenant amendment. Courts will treat such a bylaw change as invalid if challenged. Another legal expert, Professor Susan French, one of the drafters of the Uniform Common Interest Ownership Act, has emphasized in her writings that bylaws are intended to regulate the mechanics of governance, not the substance of ownership rights. Attempting to regulate rentals through bylaws is, in her words, a category error. The appropriate tool is a covenant amendment, which necessarily involves homeowner approval. Next, the governance perspective. Community management professionals warn boards against overreaching, not only for legal reasons but for practical ones. HOA consultant Nancy Thomas notes, boards that attempt to impose sweeping restrictions without member involvement often trigger backlash. Even if they prevail in the short term, they risk long-term erosion of trust, contested elections, and in some cases, costly litigation. Indeed, litigation is a recurring theme. According to data compiled by the Community Associations Institute, Disputes over rental restrictions rank among the top 5 sources of HOA lawsuits nationwide. These lawsuits are expensive, divisive, and rarely produce winners. Boards may win the legal argument but lose the confidence of their members, while homeowners may win in court but bear the emotional and financial burden of prolonged conflict. From an ethical and policy standpoint, experts emphasize balance. Urban planning scholar Dr. Edward Getz observes that communities face legitimate concerns about short-term rentals, noise, parking, and the erosion of neighborhood cohesion. At the same time, outright bans raise questions of equity and fairness. Many homeowners rely on rental income to afford their mortgages, particularly in high-cost areas. Cutting off this option can disproportionately harm younger families and middle-income owners. In Colorado specifically, housing economists note that STRs play a dual role. On one hand, they reduce long-term rental supply, contributing to affordability challenges. On the other, they support tourism economies, particularly in mountain towns. Local governments, recognizing this tension, typically craft nuanced regulations, caps, licensing, safety requirements rather than blanket prohibitions. When HOA letters step in with outright bans, they may upset this delicate balance. Insurance experts also weigh in. STR activity can change the risk profile of a community. More transient occupants may mean higher risk of property damage or liability incidents. Insurers sometimes require HOAs to disclose STR activity, and in rare cases, premiums can be affected, but as risk manager Alan Brewster points out, the proper response is not necessarily prohibition. It is disclosure, appropriate coverage, and, if necessary, risk-sharing agreements. When we synthesize these expert views, one conclusion emerges: HOA boards must tread carefully. They have both the power and the responsibility to maintain community standards, but they do not have carte blanche authority. Restrictions that affect the fundamental use of property demand owner consent. Attempting to bypass the consent is both legally precarious and ethically questionable. For homeowners, the takeaway from these experts is equally important. Knowledge is leverage. Understanding the hierarchy of documents, CC&Rs above bylaws. Bylaws above rules equips owners to challenge overreach. Knowing the thresholds 25% for quorum, 67% for covenant amendments prevents intimidation. And recognizing the broader context, housing markets, insurance implications. Community cohesion adds credibility to homeowner arguments. Perhaps the most telling expert observation comes from governance scholar Dr. Wayne Hyatt, who once wrote, "Community associations function best when boards remember they are stewards, not rulers. Their legitimacy depends on consent, transparency, and proportionality. In the Colorado case, that statement could not be more relevant. The board may have believed it was protecting the community, but without homeowner approval, it risks stepping outside its legitimate role. In sum, the experts tell us this: the law is clear, the risks are real, and the ethical path forward is participation, not unilateral action. For homeowners facing similar conflicts, the advice is to stay informed, stay organized, and, if necessary, seek legal counsel. Because when it comes to HOA power struggles, knowledge and solidarity are the strongest defenses."
And so, we return to the Colorado neighborhood where it all began. A quiet community, a board determined to impose order, and a group of homeowners suddenly forced to question how much control they really have over their own property. What started as a single Reddit post from user Truly Bob Barker, just a homeowner looking for clarity, quickly became a microcosm of a national issue. How far should HOAs be allowed to go in limiting personal freedom? And at what point do the rights of the collective stop and the rights of the individual begin? Legally, the experts told us the answer is clear. Boards cannot change property use restrictions through bylaws. Material changes require homeowner approval, often 2/3 or more. Ethically, the principles are just as clear. No small group should impose sweeping restrictions without transparency, consent, and fairness. But beyond the law and the ethics, this case reminds us of something deeper: the lived reality of being a homeowner in HOA America. For some, an HOA means manicured lawns, protected property values, and a sense of order. The Colorado board thought it could take a shortcut, but homeowners pushed back. They asked questions. They dug into the bylaws and CC&Rs. They demanded accountability. And that is where real power lies, not in the boardroom, but in the collective voice of the owners themselves. Viewers, if you take one thing away from this story, let it be this: know your rights. Know your documents. Know the thresholds for quorum and amendments. Because when boards overstep, knowledge is your shield. And don't underestimate the power of solidarity. A single voice on Reddit sparked discussion. A handful of homeowners reading their governing documents can change the trajectory of a community, and a group of owners standing together can stop even the most determined board from erasing their rights. Now, let's look beyond Colorado. This isn't an isolated story. Across the United States, homeowners are facing similar battles. Fines for landscaping choices, lawsuits over paint colors, liens for missed fees, and restrictions on everything from solar panels to holiday decorations. HOAs were created to preserve property values, but too often they become sources of stress, conflict, and even foreclosure. That's why stories like this matter. They shine a light on the gray areas, the tension between community and individuality, order and freedom, governance and overreach. And they remind us that while HOAs may be powerful, they are not invincible. They are bound by law, by ethics, and most importantly, by the will of the people who actually live in the communities they govern. So, what do you think? Should HOAs have the power to ban short-term rentals, even when local law allows them? Or should homeowners be free to decide, as long as they follow city regulations? Do you side with the board protecting community harmony, or the homeowners fighting for property rights? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Share your own HOA nightmare stories. Because the more we talk about these issues, the harder it becomes for HOAs to operate in the shadows. And if you've ever been blindsided by an HOA letter, hit that like button. If you've ever fought back and won, share this video with your neighbors. And if you want to keep learning about the hidden world of HOAs, the injustices, the reforms, the stories that boards don't want you to hear, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. This has been another deep dive into HOA injustice, brought to life by a single post, a single question, and a conflict that reflects thousands of similar battles across the country. Until next time, remember, your home is more than just your property. It's your sanctuary, and protecting it starts with knowing your rights.